The ancient world is often shaped by the shadows of civilizations that have disappeared, leaving behind only fragments of their once great cultures and enigmatic histories that are woven into the fabric of our collective curiosity. Among the most mysterious and compelling stories are those of the Anasazi and the Sea Peoples, two groups whose stories remain hidden in the sands of time, their cultures vanishing seemingly without trace. The question that hangs over both of these ancient peoples is not just why they disappeared, but how they managed to leave such a lasting imprint on history, despite their absence. These two ancient groups, separated by continents, yet bound together by the common thread of vanishing from the historical record, compel us to search for answers in the very remnants they left behind. Ruins, myths, and the echoes of their once thriving cultures. In the arid southwest of modern-day America, the Anasazi, or ancient Puebloans, flourished for centuries. They built sprawling communities, constructed massive stone dwellings, and created a sophisticated system of agriculture in one of the harshest landscapes imaginable. The Anasazi are famous for their cliff dwellings, structures carved into the sides of canyons, which seem to defy both nature and logic. These structures, along with the pottery, rock art, and advanced irrigation systems that they left behind, tell the story of a people deeply connected to their land, whose lives were intricately woven with the rhythm of the seasons and the scarce waters that cut through the desert. The Sea Peoples, on the other hand, were a group of enigmatic maritime raiders and settlers who were said to have caused widespread disruption throughout the Mediterranean during the Late Bronze Age. Their origins remain a mystery. Some theorists suggest they came from the Aegean. Others speculate they were a confederation of various seafaring tribes from regions as far-reaching as Anatolia, the Levant, and beyond. What is known is that they were a force that seemed to appear out of nowhere, their invasions wreaking havoc on once prosperous kingdoms and civilizations, such as the Hittites and the Egyptians. They are best remembered for the destruction they caused. Yet little is known about their culture, their reasons for their violent incursions, or even their ultimate fate. What remains are fragments, like the cryptic hieroglyphs from Egyptian tombs and the odd references to the Sea Peoples in ancient texts that hint at their existence, but never fully reveal the full story of who they were and why they vanished. The question of how entire civilizations can simply disappear from history is one that haunts us. What makes these civilizations unique is not just that they vanished, but the utter mystery surrounding their disappearances. Why did the Anasazi abandon their cliff dwellings in the 12th century, leaving behind entire cities to be reclaimed by the desert? What caused their once thriving communities to collapse so suddenly, leaving no clear trace of their ultimate fate? The prevailing theories are many: drought, social upheaval, and even warfare. Yet, no one theory can fully account for the disappearance of the Anasazi. Was it a slow unraveling of a culture over time, or was it a rapid and traumatic exodus driven by factors beyond their control? The evidence left behind is tantalizing, but ultimately incomplete, forcing us to piece together their story from the shards of the past. Similarly, the Sea Peoples remain an enigma. They appear in ancient Egyptian texts as an unstoppable force, their name appearing on the walls of temples and references to invasions that led to the fall of mighty civilizations. But the Sea People's identity is shrouded in mystery. Were they a group of displaced refugees, pushed out of their homelands by famine, invasion, or natural disaster? Or were they a coalition of pirates and mercenaries who sought to exploit the weakening of the great empires of the Bronze Age? Evidence of their existence comes from inscriptions and the accounts of the Egyptians, but there is little to directly explain their origins, their motivations, or their ultimate fate. Some scholars suggest they may have been absorbed into the societies they destroyed, their identity lost to history as they merged with the very civilizations they had once toppled. Despite the gaps in the historical record, what remains from these ancient peoples is enough to spark an ongoing fascination. The ruins of the Anasazi are still visible in the desert landscapes of the American Southwest, offering a glimpse into the lives of a people who were in tune with the land in ways we may never fully understand. The Sea Peoples, though shrouded in myth, have left behind their own set of symbols, fragments of their impact on the ancient world. The artistic and archaeological remnants of their invasions tell a tale of destruction, but also of cultural exchange, the melding of peoples and ideas in a world that was often on the brink of collapse. What makes these stories so compelling is not just the mystery of their disappearance, but the larger questions they raise about the nature of civilization itself. How do cultures rise to prominence, and how do they fall? What causes societies to thrive, and what forces bring about their eventual disintegration? The Anasazi and the Sea Peoples remind us that history is not a linear path of progress, but a series of ebbs and flows, of rise and fall. We are left to wonder what made these civilizations so powerful and why they were unable to survive the tides of history that swept them away. The story of the Anasazi is not merely the story of a people who vanished. It is a story of resilience in the face of extreme adversity. The people of the American Southwest adapted to an unforgiving environment, developing sophisticated farming techniques and creating an intricate network of settlements that allowed them to thrive in a landscape where others would have faltered. Yet, for all their ingenuity, they could not escape the forces of nature that ultimately undermined their existence. The long droughts, the shifting climate, the pressures of neighboring cultures, all of these contributed to the unraveling of the Anasazi civilization. But even in their decline, the Anasazi left behind a cultural legacy that would endure for centuries. The ruins of their dwellings, their pottery, and their art continue to speak to us, telling the story of a people who lived in harmony with the land and who left behind a footprint that has never been fully erased. The Sea Peoples, on the other hand, represent the darker side of human history, the chaos and violence that accompany the collapse of great empires. Their invasions are seen as a symptom of a larger crisis that gripped the Bronze Age world, one that saw the destruction of long-standing civilizations and the destabilization of established political systems. Their story is one of displacement, of peoples pushed to the margins of the known world by forces beyond their control. But their impact was not solely destructive. The Sea Peoples helped to create the conditions for the rise of new powers in the Mediterranean, from the Greeks to the Phoenicians, whose cultures would go on to shape the course of history. The Sea Peoples may have disappeared, but their influence can still be felt in the civilizations that rose from the ashes of the world they left behind. These two stories, separated by vast distances and centuries of time, are linked by their common theme of disappearance. The Anasazi and the Sea Peoples vanished, leaving behind only traces of their existence. And it is this mystery that continues to fascinate us. As we begin to explore their stories, we are reminded that history is not a static record of events, but a living, breathing narrative shaped by the forces of nature, culture, and human ambition. The answers to the questions about the Anasazi and the Sea Peoples may never be fully known, but the search for those answers is what drives us to continue to explore the mysteries of the past. What happened to these lost civilizations is more than just a question of historical curiosity. It is a reflection of our own desire to understand the rise and fall of civilizations and the forces that shape the course of human history. As we embark on this journey, we step into the shadows of two vanished civilizations, piecing together the clues they left behind. What we find may never be the full picture, but it will offer us a glimpse into the lives of people whose stories have been obscured by time. The Anasazi and the Sea Peoples may be lost to history, but their legacies endure, and in their stories, we find echoes of our own hopes, fears, and ambitions. A reminder that the past is never truly gone, as long as we continue to seek its truth. The desert landscape of the American Southwest, with its vast, rugged terrain and harsh environment, is an unlikely cradle for civilization. Yet, the Anasazi managed to thrive in this inhospitable region for centuries, carving out a complex society in the arid canyons and mesas. Their ability to adapt to the extremes of climate, geography, and scarcity was a testament to their ingenuity and resilience. They lived in communities that stretched across a vast territory, ranging from the Four Corners region, where Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah meet, to the canyonlands of Colorado and Utah. At the peak of their civilization, the Anasazi built massive cliff dwellings, monumental stone structures perched precariously on the sides of sheer canyon walls. These dwellings, as well as the remains of large, communal pueblos, represent the ingenuity of a culture that understood the importance of security, sustainability, and communal living. The Anasazi's early history is difficult to trace, but archaeological evidence suggests that they were originally a part of the basket maker culture, which emerged around 1500 BCE. Over time, they developed more sophisticated forms of architecture and agriculture. Unlike many other ancient cultures that relied solely on hunting and gathering, the Anasazi invented and perfected methods of farming that allowed them to sustain large populations. Their most notable innovation was the cultivation of corn, beans, and squash, known as the Three Sisters, which formed the foundation of their agricultural system. With this knowledge, they were able to feed not only their families but entire communities. They also developed complex irrigation systems that channeled water from the rivers and streams into their fields, enabling them to farm in an otherwise arid landscape. But their ingenuity did not stop with agriculture. The Anasazi also built impressive roads and trading networks that stretched across the desert. These trade routes connected them to other Native American groups, allowing the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultural practices. Pottery, jewelry, and textiles produced by the Anasazi were highly prized and traded throughout the region, demonstrating the cultural and economic sophistication of their society. Yet, it wasn't just material wealth that the Anasazi traded. They also exchanged knowledge. The intricate knowledge of astronomy, the seasonal movements of celestial bodies, and the cyclical patterns of nature played a crucial role in the lives of the Anasazi. They constructed ceremonial kivas, or subterranean chambers, which were not only places of worship, but also astronomical observatories, aligned with the movements of the sun and stars. These observatories were integral to their understanding of time and the seasons, guiding agricultural cycles and ritual practices. The evidence suggests that the Anasazi culture was not monolithic. Different regions within the larger Anasazi world exhibited unique architectural styles, pottery, and religious practices, indicating a diversity of traditions and customs. The larger communities, however, were bound by common cultural values, particularly the emphasis on communal living, the respect for the land, and the belief in the spiritual significance of the natural world. The cliff dwellings themselves reveal much about the Anasazi worldview. These structures, often built into the sides of cliffs, were not simply practical shelters. They were symbolic expressions of the Anasazi's connection to both the physical world and the spiritual realm. The positioning of these dwellings suggested an understanding of the surrounding landscape that was deeply intertwined with religious and cosmological beliefs. Yet, despite their profound connection to the land and their sophisticated social structures, the Anasazi civilization began to show signs of strain in the 11th century CE. Archaeological evidence indicates that by this time, the climate of the region had begun to shift. Prolonged droughts, along with environmental degradation, put enormous pressure on the Anasazi way of life. Water sources became scarcer, agricultural production declined, and the once thriving trade routes that connected the Anasazi to the rest of the Southwest became less viable. These environmental changes, combined with internal strife and external pressures from neighboring cultures, likely contributed to the unraveling of the Anasazi society. In response to these growing challenges, the Anasazi began to make dramatic changes to their way of life. Some communities retreated into the cliffs, seeking refuge in the natural fortifications offered by the canyon walls. Others abandoned their pueblos and migrated to new areas in search of more fertile land and more reliable water sources. The reasons behind this migration are still debated. Some scholars suggest that the Anasazi were driven by necessity, fleeing the harsh conditions of their environment. Others argue that there may have been social and political factors at play, including conflict with neighboring groups and a breakdown in the social cohesion that had once held the Anasazi together. Whatever the cause, the end result was a dramatic transformation. By the 13th century, the once vibrant Anasazi civilization had disappeared from the cliff dwellings and pueblos that had defined their culture for centuries. The reasons for their disappearance remain a subject of speculation, with theories ranging from environmental factors like drought to cultural collapse and warfare. The story of the Sea Peoples is similarly shrouded in mystery, though it has captivated historians for centuries. Unlike the Anasazi, whose disappearance is largely tied to environmental and social factors, the Sea Peoples' origins and motivations remain deeply enigmatic. What is known is that they were a group of maritime invaders who appeared in the eastern Mediterranean around the end of the Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE. Their attacks were part of a larger wave of upheaval that swept across the Mediterranean, leading to the collapse of several powerful civilizations, including the Hittites, Mycenaeans, and Egyptians. The Sea Peoples' invasions are mentioned in various Egyptian texts, most notably in the inscriptions of Pharaoh Ramses III, who described their attacks on Egypt. These texts, however, provide little insight into the identity or origins of the Sea Peoples. They are described as a confederation of different groups, but the exact nature of these groups is unclear. The term Sea Peoples itself is something of a mystery. It may refer to a variety of different cultures or groups that were united by their seafaring capabilities and their propensity for raiding coastal cities. The Sea Peoples are often depicted as a destructive force, responsible for the collapse of several ancient civilizations. The Egyptians, for example, speak of their successful defense against the Sea Peoples in a series of battles, but the overall impact of their invasions is far from clear. Some historians argue that the Sea Peoples were refugees, displaced by environmental factors such as famine or climate change. Others suggest that they were a band of marauders, seeking to exploit the weakened state of the Mediterranean world at the end of the Bronze Age. What is undeniable is that their invasions were part of a larger pattern of societal collapse, a period known as the Bronze Age collapse, when many once prosperous civilizations seemed to disintegrate almost overnight. Despite their destructive role in history, the Sea Peoples' legacy is complex. Their raids contributed to the downfall of the Hittite Empire and the destabilization of the Mycenaean kingdoms. But they also paved the way for the rise of new powers in the Mediterranean, particularly the Phoenicians and the Greeks. The Phoenicians, for example, were known for their seafaring skills, and many scholars believe that the Sea Peoples' invasions were, in part, a precursor to the rise of Phoenician maritime power. Similarly, the Greek Dark Ages, which followed the collapse of Mycenaean civilization, eventually gave way to the emergence of the classical Greek world. Like the Anasazi, the Sea Peoples left behind little in the way of material culture. Their invasions were recorded by other civilizations, but the Sea Peoples themselves did not leave behind lasting monuments or artifacts. What we know of them is mostly gleaned from the accounts of the civilizations they attacked, primarily the Egyptians. These accounts, though invaluable, are also somewhat biased, portraying the Sea Peoples as an external threat that disrupted the natural order of the ancient Mediterranean world. In reality, the Sea Peoples' migrations may have been more complicated. They may have been a product of a much larger social and economic transformation that took place at the end of the Bronze Age, driven by environmental, political, and cultural factors. The mysteries surrounding the Anasazi and the Sea Peoples are, in many ways, reflections of broader questions about the rise and fall of civilizations. How do empires reach their zenith, and what causes them to collapse? The story of the Anasazi and the Sea Peoples is a reminder that the forces of nature, culture, and history are often unpredictable. Their legacies endure, not in the form of grand monuments or extensive written records, but in the fragments they left behind, ruins, artifacts, and the stories that continue to captivate us. As we seek to understand the fate of these lost civilizations, we find that the answers are as elusive as the peoples themselves. The mysteries of the Anasazi and the Sea Peoples are bound up not only in their disappearance, but in the cultural and environmental dynamics that shaped their histories. In understanding these civilizations, it becomes clear that they were far more than the sum of their material remnants. The Anasazi, for example, were not simply a people who vanished from the desert. They were part of a larger cultural and ecological landscape that was shifting long before their abrupt departure. Their story is one of adaptation, innovation, and survival in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. And yet, despite their ingenuity and resilience, they, like so many ancient civilizations, were ultimately overwhelmed by the very forces they had learned to navigate. The Sea Peoples, meanwhile, represent a different kind of collapse, one brought on by the very forces of mobility, violence, and change that had once propelled the Mediterranean world into a dynamic, interconnected society. They were both a symptom of the larger chaos that swept through the late Bronze Age and an agent of that same collapse, leaving behind little more than fragments of their impact, both material and cultural. The Anasazi lived in a world shaped by extremes: extreme heat, extreme cold, and extreme scarcity. The southwestern United States, particularly the Four Corners region, is a land of breathtaking beauty but brutal realities. The high deserts and canyons, with their vivid red rock formations and deep gorges, are also home to sparse rainfall, droughts, and extreme temperature shifts. The Anasazi's ability to thrive here for centuries was not simply a matter of luck or happenstance. It was the result of extraordinary ingenuity and careful management of resources. They didn't just survive in the desert. They flourished by understanding the rhythms of their environment and adapting their technology, architecture, and social structures to the land. One of their most remarkable achievements was the construction of their cliff dwellings, which continue to captivate the imagination of modern visitors. These homes, built into the sides of steep cliffs, were not just defensive structures. They were also strategic choices in a world where the harsh desert terrain made it difficult to farm, hunt, and gather. The cliff dwellings, like those at Mesa Verde and Cliff Palace, were an ingenious solution to the challenges of their environment. They offered protection from both the elements and potential threats from raiding tribes. The sheer inaccessibility of these dwellings made them nearly impregnable. To modern eyes, these homes, built from stone, mortar, and timber, seem almost mystical, their intricate construction and positioning hinting at a deep understanding of both the land and the celestial forces that govern their world. Inside these cliff dwellings, the Anasazi developed sophisticated ways of living that combined community, religion, and practicality. Their society was built around the kiva, a subterranean chamber used for both religious ceremonies and social gatherings. The kivas were not simply places of worship. They were communal spaces that reinforced social bonds and connected the people to the spiritual world. The architecture of a kiva, often built in a circular form with a small opening to the sky, suggests a connection to the natural world and a profound understanding of the cycles of life, death, and renewal. The placement of these kivas, often aligned with the rising and setting of the sun, further indicates that the Anasazi were a people deeply connected to the cosmos. Their civilization was intricately linked to the land, and they lived in a world where every rock, plant, and animal was seen as possessing spiritual significance. But this deep connection to the land could not protect them from the forces of nature that were beyond their control. Beginning around the 11th century, the Anasazi began to experience a series of prolonged droughts, which exacerbated the challenges of living in such a fragile environment. Water, the lifeblood of their agricultural systems, became scarcer, and their once prosperous trade routes were disrupted by the changing climate. The exact reasons for the decline of the Anasazi are still debated, but it is clear that the environmental pressures they faced were enormous. The climate shifts that took place during the 12th and 13th centuries, coupled with the increasing demand for resources, pushed the Anasazi to the brink. Some scholars have argued that social and political factors also played a role in their decline. There is evidence that the Anasazi experienced increasing internal conflict during this period, as competition for resources became more intense. Warfare, both internal and external, may have contributed to the unraveling of their society. The collapse of large, multi-family communities, which had once served as the foundation of Anasazi society, marked the beginning of the end. By the mid-13th century, most of the cliff dwellings had been abandoned, and the Anasazi had largely disappeared from the landscape they had once dominated. Theories abound about the ultimate fate of the Anasazi. Some believe they migrated to other regions, while others suggest that the civilization collapsed under the weight of its own internal contradictions. But what is certain is that the Anasazi, whose influence had once stretched across vast swaths of the American Southwest, vanished from the historical record in a way that still defies full understanding. The Sea peoples, though separated by vast distances and centuries of time, shared a certain sense of the transitory. While the Anasazi adapted to the land, the Sea peoples represented a different kind of adaptation, one that involved constant movement and the seeking of new territories. Their story, too, is one of survival in a world that was rapidly changing, a world in which the traditional structures of power, trade, and culture were being dismantled by forces both natural and human. The Sea people's emergence as a powerful and disruptive force in the Mediterranean is tied to the broader collapse of the Bronze Age world, a period in which several once great civilizations, including the Hittites, Mycenaeans, and Egyptians, were brought to their knees. Much like the Anasazi, the Sea people's origins are shrouded in mystery. The term Sea peoples itself is a modern invention, coined by scholars to describe a loose confederation of maritime raiders and settlers who struck at the heart of the Mediterranean world during the late Bronze Age. The Egyptians, whose pharaohs were among the primary victims of Sea people's raids, referred to them in their inscriptions, but they did not offer a clear identification of who the Sea peoples actually were. According to the Egyptian records, the Sea peoples were a people who came from the sea, a broad term that could refer to anyone from the Aegean to the Levant or even beyond. Some scholars have suggested that the Sea peoples were refugees, displaced by famine, climate change, or other environmental factors. Others argue that they were simply marauders, pirates, and warriors who sought to exploit the instability in the Mediterranean at the time. The Sea peoples are best remembered for their role in the Bronze Age collapse, a period around 1200 BCE when several great civilizations were abruptly overrun or fell into ruin. The Egyptians under Pharaoh Ramses III were among the most successful in repelling the Sea peoples, as seen in the famous Battle of the Delta. However, despite their military victories, the Egyptians were not immune to the larger forces at play. The Sea peoples contributed to the destabilization of the region, but they were also part of a broader wave of migration, destruction, and upheaval. The collapse of the Mycenaean kingdoms, the decline of the Hittite Empire, and the destruction of the great cities of the Eastern Mediterranean were all intertwined with the Sea people's invasions. But their ultimate fate remains unknown. Did they disappear after their raids? Or did they assimilate into the cultures they had conquered? Did they become the ancestors of the Mediterranean civilizations that followed? The answers are lost to history. What is clear, however, is that the Sea peoples were part of a larger pattern of societal collapse. The Bronze Age collapse was not the result of a single event, but rather a confluence of factors: environmental changes, economic disruptions, internal rebellions, and the destabilization of long-standing political systems. In many ways, the Sea peoples were a reflection of the larger forces that were shaking the foundations of the ancient world. They were not just raiders. They were also harbingers of change. The collapse of the Great Bronze Age empires created a power vacuum that allowed new civilizations, such as the Greeks and Phoenicians, to rise from the ashes. In the end, the Anasazi and the Sea peoples represent two very different responses to the forces that shaped their worlds. The Anasazi, through their ingenuity and connection to the land, were able to create a thriving society in a harsh and unforgiving environment, only to be undone by forces beyond their control. The Sea peoples, on the other hand, were a mobile force of destruction, disrupting the stability of the Mediterranean world and contributing to the end of an age. Both civilizations, however, are bound by a common theme: the fragility of human societies in the face of the changing forces of nature, culture, and history. Their stories, though separated by time and geography, remind us of the transitory nature of civilization and the ever-present challenge of survival in an unpredictable world. The disappearance of both the Anasazi and the Sea Peoples was not simply a matter of external forces overwhelming fragile civilizations. It was a confluence of environmental, social, and political shifts that shaped their trajectories in ways that would leave lasting marks on history. While these two cultures seem to belong to vastly different times and places, they share a hauntingly similar pattern of rise, brilliance, and eventual fall. The resilience of these civilizations, particularly in the face of increasingly destabilizing forces, is evident in the ways they adapted to their environments, expanded their horizons, and sought to establish a lasting legacy. Yet, even with such profound adaptability, their ultimate fates highlight the vulnerability of even the most resourceful cultures to the relentless pressures of time. For the Anasazi, the defining feature of their civilization was their ability to adapt and thrive in one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. The Southwest, with its arid deserts, high plateaus, and deep canyons, is a land that would seem inhospitable to all but the most tenacious. However, the Anasazi were able to harness the limited resources available to them, particularly water, in ways that allowed their society to flourish. The development of complex irrigation systems, which brought water from nearby rivers and streams into their fields, was a revolutionary adaptation. It allowed them to grow crops like corn, beans, and squash, staples that became the backbone of their diet and their trade. The Anasazi also created extensive networks for trading goods with neighboring groups, allowing them to access resources not available within their own environment. The most impressive testament to their ability to adapt is seen in their architecture. The cliff dwellings, which are now iconic symbols of the Anasazi, were not just functional structures. They were carefully designed to harmonize with their surroundings. Built into the sides of canyon walls, these homes provided protection from both the elements and potential enemies. The natural rock formations offered an effective defense, while the dwellings themselves were designed to maximize the use of limited space. The Anasazi's ability to create large, multi-family homes within these tight, often inaccessible spaces suggests an extraordinary understanding of both architecture and community dynamics. It was here, in the shadows of these cliff dwellings, that the Anasazi built a vibrant society. Despite their technological ingenuity, however, the Anasazi were far from invincible. The pressures of living in such a fragile environment, one that could experience extreme droughts or intense rainfall, eventually began to take their toll. As the 12th century drew to a close, the Southwest experienced a prolonged drought, one of several in a series of difficult climate changes that affected the region. Water became increasingly scarce, and agricultural production began to falter. The Anasazi, who had relied on the steady flow of rivers and streams for irrigation, were now facing a situation in which these very resources were drying up. For a civilization that had been built on agriculture, this posed an existential threat. But it wasn't just the climate that destabilized the Anasazi. Increasing pressure from neighboring groups, competition for resources, and perhaps even internal conflict began to unravel the fabric of their society. The Anasazi were not isolated. They lived in a dynamic and often tumultuous environment where trade, politics, and warfare intersected. Their societal structure, once robust and cooperative, was now facing the strain of overpopulation, resource depletion, and the stresses that come with living in such a fragile ecological system. In response to these mounting challenges, the Anasazi began to abandon their once thriving cliff dwellings. Archaeological evidence suggests that many of the Anasazi migrated southward to more fertile lands in what is now modern-day New Mexico, Arizona, and northern Mexico. This mass migration marks a critical turning point in their history. The ruins of their great cliff dwellings, once bustling centers of life, now stand as silent reminders of a civilization in decline. The reasons for this migration remain complex, with climate change, warfare, and internal social fragmentation all contributing to the collapse. What is certain, however, is that the Anasazi, once a thriving and innovative people, were unable to sustain their society against the compounded pressures they faced. They vanished from their cliffside homes, their cultural memory largely erased by time, leaving only their stone dwellings behind as a testament to their once great civilization. In the case of the Sea Peoples, their rise and eventual decline similarly highlight the fragile nature of empires and the ways in which external pressures, whether environmental, social, or political, can lead to profound transformations. Unlike the Anasazi, whose society was built in close connection to the land, the Sea Peoples were a people defined by their mobility and their ability to navigate the seas. They were seafaring warriors and traders, moving between regions and empires, often as agents of destruction, but also as catalysts for the shifting tides of history. The Sea Peoples emerged during a time when the Mediterranean world was undergoing significant upheaval. The Late Bronze Age, a period known for its flourishing trade networks and powerful empires, was facing a crisis. A series of natural disasters, including earthquakes, famines, and a general climate shift, placed tremendous strain on the civilizations that dominated the region, from the Hittites to the Mycenaeans. With these systems destabilized, the Sea Peoples, many of whom were likely displaced by these disasters, found opportunity in chaos. They raided coastal cities, attacked merchant fleets, and destabilized the political order of the time. Though much about the Sea Peoples remains unknown, their impact is undeniable. They were not simply destructive raiders. They were, in many ways, the harbingers of a larger collapse. The civilizations they attacked were not merely toppled by brute force, but were also weakened by the pressures of economic disruption, internal strife, and the unraveling of long-standing trade networks. The Sea Peoples may have played a pivotal role in the disintegration of the Hittite Empire, the fall of the Mycenaean kingdoms, and the destabilization of Egypt. The invasions were part of a larger process of transformation that was reshaping the Mediterranean world. The Bronze Age collapse, as it is known, was not a singular event, but a series of interconnected crises that culminated in the collapse of many once great powers. However, like the Anasazi, the Sea People's story is not simply one of destruction. It is also a story of rebirth and renewal. While their invasions led to the fall of established powers, they also contributed to the emergence of new ones. The collapse of the Mycenaeans, for example, led to the rise of the Greeks, who would go on to establish one of the most influential civilizations in history. Similarly, the Sea People's raids weakened the Hittites and the Egyptians, creating a vacuum that allowed smaller kingdoms and city-states, like the Phoenicians, to rise to prominence. In this way, the Sea Peoples were not merely agents of destruction. They were also contributors to a larger process of social and cultural transformation that ultimately led to the formation of new political and economic systems. While the Sea Peoples were known for their destruction, there are also indications that they were capable of integration and assimilation. The remnants of their culture can be found in the areas they conquered, suggesting that, rather than disappearing entirely, they may have blended into the very civilizations they helped to destroy. Some scholars believe that the Philistines, for example, may have been one of the groups of Sea Peoples, and that they went on to establish their own kingdoms in the Levant. If this is true, the Sea Peoples' legacy would be far more complex than that of mere marauders. They would have been a force not just for destruction, but for the creation of new political and cultural entities in the ancient world. Both the Anasazi and the Sea People's stories serve as powerful reminders of the fragility of civilizations and the unpredictable forces that shape human history. The Anasazi's decline was a result of environmental challenges, social pressures, and perhaps even the erosion of the very social cohesion that had once sustained their society. The Sea Peoples, on the other hand, were a product of their time, a time of great upheaval, where the collapse of empires and the rise of new forces led to the destabilization of the Mediterranean world. Both groups were unable to withstand the forces that ultimately brought about their demise. Yet both left behind legacies that continue to intrigue and captivate us. The ruins of the Anasazi, standing against the backdrop of a vast and empty desert, and the fragments of the Sea People's impact, scattered across the Mediterranean, remain reminders of the impermanence of human achievements. Their stories are not just the stories of lost civilizations. They're stories of the resilience, adaptability, and fragility of cultures in a constantly shifting world. The fall of the Anasazi and the Sea Peoples serves as a poignant reminder that the rise and fall of civilizations are not isolated phenomena, but rather part of larger cycles of human history. Both the Anasazi and the Sea Peoples faced challenges that were, in many ways, outside of their control, forces of nature, social unrest, and environmental pressures. Yet, these factors did not simply lead to the end of their civilizations. They also catalyzed broader transformations in the landscapes they once dominated. The legacies of these two ancient peoples are still evident in the ruins they left behind and in the profound mysteries that continue to perplex historians and archaeologists. The Anasazi's cliff dwellings, tucked into the sides of towering canyons, and the Sea People's impact on the Mediterranean world, marked by the fall of empires and the rise of new powers, speak not only to the fragility of civilizations, but also to their enduring power to shape the world long after their decline. The Anasazi were a people defined by their deep connection to the land and their remarkable ability to adapt to one of the most arid and harsh environments on Earth. Their sophisticated agricultural practices, including the cultivation of maize, beans, and squash, and their innovative use of irrigation systems, allowed them to survive and thrive in a region where other societies might have faltered. But this agricultural success was not without its challenges. The Anasazi lived in an area where water was scarce and where the climate could shift dramatically over short periods. Extended droughts, which were common in the region, could devastate crops and bring entire communities to the brink of collapse. Despite the technological advances that allowed them to create vast communities, such as the cliff dwellings that have become synonymous with their culture, the Anasazi were not impervious to the larger forces that shaped the Southwest. As the 12th century wore on, the climate in the American Southwest began to shift, and periods of extreme drought began to take their toll on agricultural production. The once thriving trade routes, which connected the Anasazi to other Native American groups and brought in vital resources such as pottery, textiles, and even turquoise, became increasingly difficult to maintain as water sources dried up. The reliance on irrigation, while ingenious, became a double-edged sword as the water that fed their crops became more erratic and less predictable. The Anasazi, once able to control and manipulate their environment to great success, found themselves at the mercy of forces beyond their control. By the time the 13th century arrived, the once thriving Anasazi communities had begun to collapse. Evidence suggests that the people began migrating away from their cliff dwellings, some seeking refuge in the more temperate areas of New Mexico, Arizona, and northern Mexico. This migration was not just a flight from environmental pressures. It was also a response to increasing social and political stress. Archaeological findings suggest that the Anasazi were experiencing internal strife, perhaps over access to dwindling resources or competing visions for their future. The social cohesion that had once held their communities together began to fray, and what had been a unified and innovative society began to fragment. The transition from centralized, communal society to one defined by migration and decentralization marked the end of the Anasazi civilization as it had been known. By the mid-13th century, the great cliff dwellings and expansive pueblos that had once dotted the landscape were abandoned. The people who had built these homes, who had lived in close connection to the land, had disappeared from the historical record. Their ruins, now silent and overgrown by the desert, remain a haunting reminder of the fragility of civilizations and the unpredictability of environmental and social forces. The legacy of the Anasazi, however, did not disappear with their migration. While their civilization may have been lost to time, The cultural influence of the Anasazi endured, particularly among the Native American groups who followed in their footsteps. The Hopi, Zuni, and other Pueblo peoples can trace many of their customs and traditions back to the Anasazi. The architectural techniques and agricultural practices developed by the Anasazi influenced the cultures that would come after them, even as their original society vanished from the desert landscape. The stories of the Anasazi, passed down through generations, continue to shape the identity of the people who now live in the Southwest. The Sea peoples, though they lived in a different time and place, faced a similar set of challenges. Their story is one of migration, destruction, and transformation, forces that mirror the rise and fall of the Anasazi, though on a much broader scale. The Sea peoples were a group of seafaring peoples who emerged during the Late Bronze Age, a period marked by increasing instability and upheaval in the Mediterranean. Like the Anasazi, the Sea peoples did not exist in isolation. Their history was shaped by the complex networks of trade, migration, and political alliances that span the Mediterranean world. The exact origins of the Sea peoples remain a mystery. Some scholars argue that they were displaced peoples, driven by famine, climate change, or other environmental factors. Others suggest that they were simply a coalition of raiders and mercenaries, drawn to the Mediterranean by the political and economic turmoil of the time. What is clear, however, is that the Sea peoples played a significant role in the collapse of several powerful civilizations. The Hittite Empire, which once dominated much of Anatolia and the eastern Mediterranean, was brought to its knees by a series of attacks, many of which were attributed to the Sea peoples. The Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece, which had been centers of wealth and culture, also fell victim to these invasions. And even Egypt, the great powerhouse of the ancient world, found itself at war with the Sea peoples, whose raids threatened to destabilize the region. Despite their role in the destruction of these ancient powers, the Sea peoples were not a purely destructive force. Their invasions, while devastating, also contributed to the reshaping of the Mediterranean world. The collapse of the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, and other civilizations created a vacuum that allowed new powers to rise. The Phoenicians, for example, emerged as one of the dominant maritime cultures of the post-Bronze Age world. The Sea peoples' attacks on the established powers may have played a role in paving the way for the rise of the Phoenicians, whose ships would later dominate Mediterranean trade. The Sea peoples' impact was also felt in the Levant, where their raids destabilized many of the ancient city-states. One of the most enduring legacies of the Sea peoples may be their role in the creation of the Philistin culture. According to some historians, the Philistines were one of the groups that came to the region as part of the Sea peoples' migrations, eventually settling in the coastal cities of the Levant. The Philistines would go on to establish their own kingdom, which would become one of the main rivals of the ancient Israelites. In this way, the Sea peoples' legacy extended far beyond their initial invasions, shaping the course of history in ways that were not immediately apparent. Like the Anasazi, the Sea peoples left behind few material traces of their civilization. Most of what we know about them comes from the records of the civilizations they attacked. The Egyptians, for example, left detailed accounts of their battles with the Sea peoples, depicting them as a terrifying force. But these records, while invaluable, do not provide us with a clear understanding of the Sea peoples' origins, culture, or ultimate fate. The Sea peoples' story, much like that of the Anasazi, is one of disappearance, of a people who came and left their mark on history, only to vanish into the annals of time. Despite the gaps in our knowledge, the Sea peoples, like the Anasazi, remain a powerful symbol of the volatility and transience of human civilization. Their story, intertwined with the collapse of the Bronze Age world, serves as a reminder that no empire, no matter how powerful, is immune to the forces of change. The Sea peoples were part of a larger wave of transformation that reshaped the Mediterranean world, much as the Anasazi were part of a larger cultural and environmental shift that affected the American Southwest. Both the Anasazi and the Sea peoples remind us that the history of human civilization is never a simple, linear progression, but a series of ebbs and flows, of rise and fall, of transformation and renewal. In the end, the stories of the Anasazi and the Sea Peoples are not just the stories of civilizations lost to time. They are stories of resilience, adaptation, and, ultimately, the fragility of human achievement. The ruins they left behind, though silent, continue to speak to us, urging us to reflect on the forces that shape our own societies and the legacy we will leave for those who come after us. The decline of ancient civilizations often leaves us with more questions than answers. As we attempt to understand why such advanced societies disappeared, we are confronted with a range of possible causes. Environmental catastrophes, social disintegration, internal strife, and external invasions. The Anasazi and the Sea Peoples, two cultures separated by both time and geography, provide compelling case studies of the ways in which civilizations can rise to great heights and then fall into obscurity, leaving behind only remnants that spark curiosity, wonder, and, sometimes, awe. In both cases, the sudden and often inexplicable collapse of their societies speaks not only to the fragility of human endeavors, but also to the complexity of the forces at play. The Anasazi, who flourished in the American Southwest for nearly 1,000 years, achieved remarkable advancements in agriculture, architecture, and social organization. Yet, despite their ingenuity, they eventually faced an environmental crisis that challenged the very foundation of their existence. The Southwest, with its vast deserts and rugged terrain, may seem inhospitable to modern eyes, but for the Anasazi, it was home. The land, harsh and unforgiving, was nonetheless rich in resources, and the Anasazi learned to manipulate those resources to their advantage. They developed sophisticated irrigation techniques that allowed them to grow crops in a region that receives only minimal rainfall. Their mastery of water management helped them create agricultural systems that supported large, complex communities. However, the very environment that allowed them to thrive would ultimately contribute to their downfall. The Anasazi were heavily dependent on water for their survival. Their sophisticated irrigation systems, though effective, were vulnerable to shifts in the climate. Beginning in the late 12th century, the Southwest experienced a prolonged period of drought, one of the most severe in the region's history. The rivers and streams that the Anasazi had relied on began to dry up, and their crops began to fail. The once fertile fields that had sustained their communities became barren, and the Anasazi found themselves facing an existential crisis. As water became increasingly scarce, the very foundation of their civilization began to crumble. This environmental collapse was compounded by social and political pressures. The Anasazi had built a complex society with large, multi-family communities, but as resources became more scarce, competition for those resources intensified. Internal conflicts likely arose as different groups vied for control over diminishing water supplies, arable land, and other essential resources. This social unrest, combined with the increasing difficulty of sustaining large populations, may have hastened the decline of Anasazi civilization. Evidence suggests that by the mid-13th century, many Anasazi communities had begun to abandon their cliff dwellings and pueblos, migrating to more fertile lands to the south and east. The exact reasons for their migration remain unclear, but it is likely that environmental stress, combined with social and political instability, played a significant role in the decision to abandon their ancestral homes. Despite the collapse of their civilization, the Anasazi left behind a rich cultural legacy. The cliff dwellings and pueblos they built are a testament to their architectural ingenuity, and the pottery, textiles, and artifacts they produce continue to be studied by archaeologists today. Even though the Anasazi civilization no longer exists in its original form, their descendants, the modern Pueblo peoples, carry on many of the traditions and practices that were first developed by their ancestors. The story of the Anasazi serves as a powerful reminder of the resilience of human societies, even in the face of overwhelming challenges, and of the enduring impact that a civilization can have on future generations. In the Mediterranean, the story of the Sea Peoples is similarly one of great upheaval and transformation. Unlike the Anasazi, whose downfall was precipitated by environmental factors, the Sea Peoples were part of a larger wave of social and political destabilization that swept through the ancient world. Their rise to prominence coincided with the collapse of several powerful empires, including the Hittite and Mycenaean civilizations, and their invasions are often seen as a symptom of a broader crisis in the late Bronze Age. The Sea Peoples were not a single, unified group. Rather, they were a coalition of different peoples, many of whom came from the Eastern Mediterranean, the Aegean, and perhaps even further afield. What they shared in common was their seafaring nature and their propensity for raiding coastal cities. The exact origins of the Sea Peoples remain a mystery. Some historians have speculated that they were displaced peoples forced to migrate due to environmental pressures such as famine or drought. Others argue that they were simply a band of marauding warriors, seeking to exploit the vulnerabilities of the crumbling Bronze Age empires. Whatever the cause of their migration, the Sea Peoples had a profound impact on the Mediterranean world. Their raids, which targeted some of the most prosperous and powerful civilizations of the time, contributed to the collapse of the Hittite Empire, the destruction of Mycenaean cities, and the destabilization of Egypt. The invasions were part of a larger pattern of disruption that led to the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the so-called Dark Ages in the Mediterranean. In Egypt, the Sea Peoples became the subject of extensive documentation. Pharaoh Ramses III, who ruled during the 12th century BCE, famously recorded his battles with the Sea Peoples in a series of inscriptions. According to these records, the Sea Peoples launched a series of devastating attacks on Egypt's borders, attempting to invade the Nile Delta. Ramses III, however, was able to repel the invaders, and the Sea Peoples were forced to retreat. Yet, despite this victory, Egypt was not immune to the larger forces of destabilization that were sweeping across the region. The Sea Peoples, though defeated, had contributed to the collapse of the established order. Their raids, combined with internal strife and external invasions, weakened Egypt's power and set the stage for the eventual decline of the new kingdom. The destruction wrought by the Sea Peoples extended beyond Egypt. In the Aegean, the Mycenaean civilization, which had been a dominant power in the region, was brought to its knees. The Mycenaeans, known for their impressive palaces and wealth, were no match for the Sea Peoples' raids, and their cities were destroyed. The collapse of the Mycenaean civilization marked the end of the Greek Bronze Age and the beginning of a period of relative obscurity, the Greek Dark Ages, during which Greece would fall into a period of fragmentation and decline. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire, one of the most powerful and sophisticated civilizations of the time, also succumbed to the Sea Peoples' attacks. The Hittites, who had once controlled vast territories in Asia Minor, were weakened by a combination of factors, including internal political strife and external invasions. The Sea Peoples, along with other groups, contributed to the disintegration of the Hittite Empire, and their fall marked the end of one of the most advanced civilizations of the Bronze Age. Despite their widespread impact, the Sea Peoples themselves left little in the way of tangible evidence. Much of what we know about them comes from the records of the civilizations they attacked. The Egyptians, in particular, left extensive accounts of their battles with the Sea Peoples, but these records are often vague and contradictory. The Sea Peoples did not leave behind monumental structures or inscriptions, and their cultural legacy is difficult to trace. Some historians argue that the Sea Peoples were eventually absorbed into the civilizations they had once raided, while others believe that they disappeared entirely, leaving no trace of their existence. In either case, their story is one of disruption and transformation, a reminder of the forces that can shape the course of history. Like the Anasazi, the Sea Peoples' downfall is tied to a larger process of change, one that was not limited to their own societies, but rather part of a broader pattern of collapse and renewal. The Sea Peoples were both victims of the changing world around them and agents of that change. Their invasions contributed to the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations, but they also paved the way for the rise of new powers in the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians, for example, emerged as one of the dominant maritime cultures in the post-Bronze Age world, and the Greek city-states began to reassert themselves after the fall of the Mycenaeans. The collapse of the Old Order, facilitated in part by the Sea Peoples, allowed new cultures and civilizations to rise from the ashes. The legacy of the Sea Peoples, like that of the Anasazi, is one of complexity and ambiguity. While their invasions were destructive, they also contributed to the reshaping of the ancient world. The Sea Peoples story is one of migration, warfare, and transformation, forces that continue to shape the course of history even today. The Anasazi, too, left behind a legacy that continues to resonate, not only in the physical remnants of their civilization, but in the cultural traditions that have survived through their descendants. In both cases, the fall of these civilizations speaks to the fragility of human societies, the unpredictability of environmental and social forces, and the enduring power of cultural legacies to shape the future. The story of civilizations is often told in terms of their great achievements, their towering monuments, their innovative technologies, their art, and their ideas. But it is also crucial to understand the deeper currents that drive civilizations toward their rise and eventual decline. The Anasazi and the Sea Peoples, although separated by time, geography, and culture, embody this dual nature of civilization. Their legacies are not merely defined by their architectural marvels or military exploits. Rather, their stories are marked by the complex interplay of environmental forces, social dynamics, and cultural evolution that shape their destinies. Understanding how these civilizations rose to prominence and ultimately faltered offers us important lessons about the fragility of human societies and the forces that, often beyond their control, shape the course of history. The Anasazi, whose legacy is most prominently displayed in the ruins of their cliff dwellings and pueblos in the American Southwest, were an innovative and adaptable people. They managed to survive and even thrive in one of the most inhospitable regions on Earth. The desert landscape they inhabited, with its wide temperature fluctuations, arid conditions, and limited water resources, might seem like an impossible environment for any human settlement. However, the Anasazi's ability to manage their environment, particularly their water resources, enabled them to develop agricultural systems that supported large, complex communities. Through a combination of irrigation techniques, the careful management of water resources, and the cultivation of maize, beans, and squash, the Anasazi were able to build a thriving agricultural society. The Anasazi's innovations extended far beyond their agricultural practices. Their architectural achievements, particularly the construction of cliff dwellings and multi-story pueblos, are perhaps the most enduring symbol of their civilization. These structures, built into the sides of cliffs or on the tops of mesas, were not merely defensive measures. They were practical responses to the challenges of living in such a rugged environment. The natural features of the landscape, steep canyon walls and rocky outcrops, provided protection from invaders, while the dwellings themselves were designed to conserve heat in the winter and keep the interiors cool during the scorching summer months. The Anasazi were not only adept at using the natural environment for their own survival, they were also able to manipulate it in ways that allowed them to create a stable, thriving society. But despite their technological and architectural accomplishments, the Anasazi were not immune to the forces of nature. One of the most significant challenges they faced was the unpredictable nature of the climate. The American Southwest is characterized by periods of extreme drought, and the Anasazi were particularly vulnerable to these changes. The irrigation systems they developed were reliant on water from nearby rivers and streams, but as the climate shifted and droughts became more prolonged, their water sources began to dry up. This environmental stress, combined with the pressure of increasing population and competition for limited resources, eventually led to the decline of their civilization. The collapse of the Anasazi civilization was not a sudden event, but rather the result of a series of environmental, social, and political factors that compounded over time. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Anasazi began to abandon their cliff dwellings and pueblos in the 12th and 13th centuries, likely in response to the prolonged droughts that affected the region. The abandonment of these communities marked a significant shift in their way of life. As the Anasazi dispersed and migrated to more fertile lands to the south and east, their once thriving culture began to fade from the historical record. Yet, even as their physical civilization declined, the cultural legacy of the Anasazi lived on. The descendants of the Anasazi, the modern Pueblo peoples, continue to inhabit the Southwest, preserving many of the traditions, customs, and techniques developed by their ancestors. The cliff dwellings and pueblos they left behind remain not only as a testament to their architectural genius, but as a reminder of the resilience of human societies in the face of overwhelming environmental and social pressures. The Sea peoples, though geographically distant from the Anasazi, faced similar challenges. Like the Anasazi, the Sea peoples lived during a time of great social and political upheaval. The Late Bronze Age, the period during which the Sea peoples rose to prominence, was characterized by widespread instability and the collapse of several powerful empires. The Sea peoples were not a unified group. They were a coalition of various peoples, many of whom came from the Eastern Mediterranean, the Aegean, and even further afield. What united them was their shared ability to navigate the seas and their propensity for raiding and destruction. The Sea peoples' rise to power is closely linked to the collapse of the Hittite Empire, the Mycenaean civilizations, and other ancient powers. Their invasions are often viewed as a symptom of the larger social and political collapse that took place during the Late Bronze Age. The decline of these empires was caused by a combination of factors, including internal political instability, economic collapse, and external invasions. The Sea peoples' raids contributed to this destabilization, but they were also a reflection of the larger forces that were reshaping the ancient world. Unlike the Anasazi, the Sea peoples did not leave behind any lasting architectural monuments or physical structures that could serve as a testament to their civilization. Instead, their legacy is preserved through the accounts of the civilizations they attacked. The Egyptians, for example, recorded their battles with the Sea peoples in inscriptions and murals, portraying them as a formidable and relentless enemy. Despite these depictions, however, little is known about the Sea peoples themselves. The Egyptian records describe them as a collection of different groups, but they offer few clues about their origins or their culture. The Sea peoples' attacks were not just about destruction, they were also about survival. Many historians believe that the Sea peoples were driven by a combination of factors, including environmental pressures such as famine, drought, and resource scarcity. Like the Anasazi, they may have been forced to migrate due to changing environmental conditions that made their homelands less hospitable. As these groups moved westward, they encountered the powerful civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean and, in many cases, successfully raided or invaded these societies. The Sea peoples' raids contributed to the collapse of the Hittite Empire and the fall of the Mycenaean civilization, two of the most powerful cultures of the Late Bronze Age. In Egypt, the Sea peoples became a significant threat to the established order. Pharaoh Ramses III, who ruled during the 12th century BCE, famously defeated the Sea peoples in a series of battles. However, despite this victory, Egypt, like many of the other civilizations of the time, was weakened by the instability caused by the Sea peoples' invasions. The destruction wrought by the Sea peoples was part of a broader process of decline that affected the entire Mediterranean world. The collapse of the Mycenaean and Hittite civilizations, combined with the invasions of the Sea peoples, marked the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of a new, more fragmented period in Mediterranean history. Despite their destructive impact, the Sea peoples were not completely erased from history. Some of the groups that had once been part of the Sea peoples coalition may have settled in the lands they had once raided. In the Levant, for example, the Philistines, who are often associated with the Sea peoples, established a powerful kingdom along the Mediterranean coast. The Philistines, though they were once invaders, eventually became an integral part of the ancient world, influencing the course of history through their interactions with other cultures, including the Israelites. Both the Anasazi and the Sea peoples illustrate the complex interplay of environmental, social, and political factors that shaped the rise and fall of civilizations. In the case of the Anasazi, their ability to adapt to a harsh environment and build a sophisticated society was ultimately undermined by the forces of nature. Prolonged droughts, coupled with social and political tensions, led to the collapse of their civilization. The Sea Peoples, on the other hand, were part of a broader wave of migration and destruction that swept across the Mediterranean world. Their rise was driven by a combination of environmental pressures and the instability of the Bronze Age empires. Though they were ultimately defeated, their legacy lives on in the civilizations that emerged in the wake of their invasions. The decline of both the Anasazi and the Sea Peoples is a testament to the fragility of human societies. No matter how advanced a civilization becomes, it is always vulnerable to the forces of nature, social change, and external threats. The stories of these two cultures remind us that even the most impressive achievements can be undone by factors beyond our control. And yet, despite their decline, both the Anasazi and the Sea Peoples left behind legacies that continue to shape the world. The Anasazi's descendants, the Pueblo peoples, continue to thrive in the American Southwest, while the Sea Peoples' impact can still be felt in the Mediterranean, where their invasions helped shape the course of history. In the end, the story of these civilizations is not just one of loss and destruction. It is a story of resilience, adaptation, and the enduring power of cultural memory.